I developed there. The Depression certainly was not over in 1940, say, when the government began to be reshaped for war purposes. After mid-1940, the administration took greater and greater actions to prepare the country for war, including in September 1940, the initiation of a military draft. So from mid-1940 onward, to a greater and greater extent, the economy is being moved away from the civilian use of goods and services to military use. And eventually, by the time we get to the war peak in 1944, we've got about 4/10 of the whole U.S. economy being devoted to military purposes. Now, people often say, in fact, almost everybody believes, even most economists believe, that the war got the economy out of the Depression. And what I've argued in my work is that this is a misunderstanding of what we mean by getting out of a depression. Yes, unemployment disappeared during the war. There's no doubt about it. It reached the lowest levels ever measured, just a little more than 1% by 1944. But why did unemployment disappear? Well, overwhelmingly for one single reason: the draft. If you start with 5 or 6 million people unemployed, and then you draft 10 million people and create an incentive for millions of others to enlist before they get drafted and end up in the infantry, then yes, you will get rid of unemployment. It's a surefire way to do it. And that's what happened during World War II. Now, at the same time, because so many people were drawn away from the civilian labor force, others came in to replace them in the production lines. And lots of women who had never worked in the paid labor force before went to work. Teenagers dropped out of school and went to work. Older people who had retired came out of retirement, went back to work. So these men were replaced in the labor force, and production was able to proceed without them. But if you look at the kind of production that grew during the war, what you find is that this is not a regular business cycle boom at all. In fact, after 1941, civilian goods and services production declined and never got back to its 1941 level until 1946, after the war had ended. So there was certainly no prosperity during the war. Many important civilian goods were rationed. There were all sorts of rules to tell people what they could and couldn't do. Gasoline was very hard to get. Public transportation was limited and preempted by military authorities. The list goes on and on. If this is your idea of prosperity, you have a very perverse idea of prosperity. It wasn't that. It was a full employment situation because of the draft and the military buildup. It was a situation in which a mountain of goods and services were being produced, but they were weapons and munitions and other goods and services aimed at maintaining, supporting, training, transporting military forces. And so the U.S. was a command economy devoted to military purposes during the war. After the war, when the demobilization took place, more than 10 million men were released from the armed forces in the first year after the war ended. Then real prosperity returned because the government gave up this huge claim it had on resources during the war and allowed them to go back into civilian use again, which they did very quickly and very smoothly. Even though many economists, particularly the young Keynesians of the day who had been prominent during the war and claimed their theories had been validated by the war boom, they all expected that the Depression would resume at the end of the war because the government was moving from a huge deficit in its budget very quickly to a surplus in its budget and reducing its overall expenditures by about 70% quite quickly. This seemed like a Keynesian recipe for plunging the economy into a renewed depression. But that didn't happen. In fact, the economy performed spectacularly in 1946-47. The unemployment rate stayed below 4% during those years. and the transition was made very smoothly as government gave up most of its wartime rules, regulation, and resource command, and released men from the armed forces. So what we saw there was, in fact, a tremendous refutation of basic Keynesian thinking. Unfortunately, the Keynesians remembered what they took to be the validation of their model during the war buildup and totally ignored its refutation by what happened at the end of the war. And I've been trying for years to make people look at both ends of the experience during the war, and also to appreciate, above all, that war and prosperity were not linked, even during World War II. Just getting rid of unemployment by putting people in the armed forces involuntarily is a horrible way to deal with a depression.
And in his book, Neither Liberty Nor Safety, Robert Higgs writes, in ways big and small, direct and indirect, crude and subtle, war, the quintessential government activity, has been the mother's milk for the nourishment of a growing tyranny in this country, and it remains so today. How does that apply to the current Iraq War?
Well, I think whenever we have the government at war, as we do now, although it's an odd kind of war, it's certainly not the kind of war we had during World War II, but whenever the government goes to war, it has an excuse for doing outrageous things. For example, it's used the excuse of the wars and the related war on terror to basically gut the Constitution's Bill of Rights. We thought we had a Fourth Amendment to protect us from warrantless search and seizure. But the government has informed us in recent years that we don't have any Fourth Amendment protection. In fact, that the government will spy on us however, whenever it wishes, and get away with it, because no one will do anything to stop it. The courts won't stop it effectively. It just goes on doing it. So our right to privacy has been egregiously violated and gutted by the government on grounds that this was a war necessity, that the government needed to spy on everybody in order to make sure that terrorism didn't occur in our midst again. It's the most outrageous kind of exploitation of the fear that goes along with war and other forms of national emergency. So this would be just one example, but there are a great many others. The government has increased its budget size hugely since 2001. Much of this was excused on the grounds that the government had to spend more to respond to the threat of terrorism. This was, for the most part, a bogus excuse, because if we look at where the money actually went, a relatively small part of it actually went to purposes that have anything to do with combating terrorism. And in fact, an enormous amount of it went to the welfare state, which was a kind of deal between the Bush administration and the Democrats, so that everybody would be cut in on the government's growth during this period of very rapid economic growth, excused by the necessity of war.
Wilmington, Delaware, please go ahead.
Yes, Mr. I'm thoroughly enjoying your your interview here. What I want to ask you is basically two things. One, what, in your opinion, just in your opinion, is how the government is going to handle the enormous, huge deficit that Social Security and Medicare has to handle in the next, 20, 30, 40 years? There's a difference of something in the area of $40 to $70 trillion, and we just simply don't have that kind of money. So how do you think that they will end up handling it? The other thing is, a lot of people think that China and Russia are going to be great military powers in the next, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever. And I maintain I don't think that's going to happen because of their population. There are going to be two countries of old people because of their birth rates, similar to the situation in France and Italy. But that's what I'd like to ask you about.